Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining yet another session of the Town Hall. And before we get into our discussion and to the program of today, first I'd like to welcome each and every one of you again, Guyanese around the world, and those who are also at home, and particularly a special welcome and good afternoon to our distinguished panelists. Like I said, before we get into anything order of business today, I would like to start off by saying that, whenever there is tragedy, whenever there is any difficulty and challenge in any one of the countries around the world, the experience of many countries or most countries is that our American or Canadian, the UK, our international partners will be there showing solidarity. And I think it's only in good stead and in good spirit that we return that respect and that solidarity to our American brothers and sisters who today have lost one of their heroes. And that is Congressman John Lewis, who have been one of the icons of the civil rights movement, particularly in contemporary American history. So with that, I'll ask myself, each and every one of our panelists, and to just give a minute of silence in respect to Congressman Lewis. Great. So our discussion this afternoon is on the topic of sanctions, Guyana and sanctions, and the other half of the story. By now, it is safe to say that the world is aware of the state of Guyana's 2020 elections and the persistent efforts by the de facto government to undermine the results of the election and prevent the declaration of the results. Since March of this year, the United States, other major Western democracies, global and multilateral partners have issued repeated warnings that any government that is sworn in on illegal election results will not be recognized, and those who are undermining democracy in Guyana will face consequences. Last Tuesday, the United States pulled the sanction lever, so to speak, and enacted visa sanctions on members of the Granger administration and those around the administration, supporters or finances of the administration. The UK, Canada, and the EU are certainly to follow suit. We have seen statements since the US has made its announcement. We've seen statements from all the other major partners of either plan or in the works to do the same. This is clearly the beginning of a long road of options for these countries if the situation is not resolved soon. We know that sanctions are a form of punishment, and we know that they can be levied against any person or organization. We also know that the powers of Western democracy as Western democracies and global institutions are very far-reaching. But what do we know beyond these facts? In this discussion today, we seek to have a better understanding of the side of the story that we don't often talk about, that is behind the scenes. Specifically, we want to talk about what forms these sanctions can take if they're escalated. What are the consequences of these sanctions? And not just what is on the face and sort of preventing people from entering a country, so to speak. How does these sanctions can move beyond the immediate individuals and start impacting society and families? What are the experience of other countries that have had to deal with these kinds of sanctions, and how did they fare? How are these sanctions enforced? And more importantly, how would violators or people who don't want to comply with these sanctions or find workarounds, so to speak, how are they dealt with? To help us understand these questions, we have with us three distinguished panelists tonight that we're very fortunate to have in our presence. We have first Jose Cardenas, as a former US official who had senior positions in both the US Congress and the executive branch. with specific focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. He is also a government relation consultant in Washington. We have Dr. Samuel Sittlington, who is a financial crime advisor with a breadth of knowledge in the areas of anti-corruption, money laundering, financing terrorism, fraud and risk analysis, and risk management. And I also wish to mention that Sam is joining us from Belfast in the UK. So it's almost past midnight or getting there about for Sam. So Sam, we're very pleased to have you with us. And no other than Mike Singh, who is a man of many hats. It's also Guyanese. He's the chairman and founder and CEO of the TC Energy and Infrastructure Group. He's a distinguished fellow in the Jinjal School of International Affairs. And he's also the president of the Latin American and Caribbean region for the Indian Overseas Congress Party. Gentlemen, a pleasant and warm good evening to you. I'd like to begin the discussion starting with Jose. The first question that I want to put to you, which is sort of general in the grand scheme of things with where Guyana is, and then we'll start to take things more specific from then, is given what you know of our electoral crisis and the fact that we are now dealing with stage 1 of sanctions from the US. How bad is this situation? How deep are we into this mess? And how much worse can it get for us?
Well, thank you, Dhanraj, for a great opening. And it's let me just say to you, thank you for the invitation to be here with the distinguished panelists, and a hearty hello to all the viewers from outside Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure for me to come and speak to you about this issue and sort of give you the view from Washington, if you will. And for the benefit of your viewers, I think it's important to understand why some may be thinking, you know, why is the United States so concerned? Why are they so active? You know, we have never seen this kind of attention from the United States before. Why now? And I think that the answer to that is it's even in a broader context to what is actually happening on the ground in Guyana today. And that is, we have to see over the last couple of decades in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, there have been, you know, it's been a tumultuous time in terms of popular confidence in countries' democratic institutions and whether democracy is delivering the goods. We saw in Latin America last year many outbreaks of protest, street protests against democratic governments. We saw the rise of Hugo Chavez before that 20 years ago, and that sort of populist movement that he introduced into the region, and what came with that was a lot of you know, Hugo Chavez basically lacked confidence in that country's, in Venezuela's existing institutions, democratic institutions. They were not delivering fair and equitable benefits to the people. So democracy has taken a hit in the Western Hemisphere over the last few years. And so there's a greater sensitivity in Washington towards indications where democracy is troubled and where it is on the verge of devolving into a national crisis. And that sort of feeds into why now, why the United States, why Guyana. And so that is by way of a bit of an explanation. And suffice it to say, Dhanraj, is that the events in Guyana are very much on the minds of U.S. officials. I speak to officials at the State Department, at the White House, and they're watching. And they say we're watching closely because this is an issue of democracy region-wide.
Great. That's a pretty good segue into the question that I want to ask you, Mike. You have extensive experience in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East with countries who are, in some sense, not in their best moments. And I'm referring to the fact that some of them would have found themselves in the unfortunate situation where Guyana is. how do countries, what are the experiences of some of those countries that you have experience with in how they deal with sanctions and how they grapple with situations like this? Success rate, consequences, what are how the things unfold that we in Guyana here should be very mindful of and take into consideration?
Good evening, Dhanraj and my esteemed other panelists. Thank you for having me. It's painful for me personally when I have to talk about Guyana, because in my 20 years career in the global telecom sector, whilst at AT&T, Tata Communications, and many other countries, there were instances where countries wanted to do business with us, but we simply couldn't because of the United States Treasury, the US Justice Department, enforcement of sanctions. I'll name three. One was Afghanistan. Afghanistan, during the Clinton era, after the bombing of some embassies, as you would recall it, Tanzania and Kenya, they pinpointed this to bin Laden. There was an American company that had actually gotten a license to build a mobile communications network in Afghanistan that was awarded to them by the Taliban. Unfortunately, sanctions went into place. That license had no value. It had to be placed into abeyance because as an American company, as an American citizen, you were expressly forbidden from going to do business in Afghanistan. Another country that we saw the consequences of sanctions is Iraq. And we remember very well how sanctions literally crippled Iraq in many ways. Another one was Libya. Libya for many years was a pariah in the international arena, in the international system. You could not do business. And as I speak today, Pakistan is in that gray list of even facing sanctions on its financial system. Pakistan is in the gray list today because not enough has been done by the Pakistani establishment to thwart international terror. The consequences also affected places like Somalia. And if you look at many of these countries I've talked about that became victims of sanctions, they never fully recovered. Eventually, the people at the top, they were able to survive. But what happened below is that the common masses went from a situation of comfort to total destitution and desperation. And in societies like those, it creates the perfect incubators for terror cells to come in and take root. Look at the countries of the Maghreb in the Sahara. Some of them don't have good governance. And where you don't have good governance, there creates a vacuum for leadership. And when democratic institutions come on the siege, those are the perfect incubators for the bad guys to move in. Because then, I'll give you an example, Sierra Leone, you know, the government back in the late 90s, the military took over. What emerged was a civil war. You had child soldiers coming to the fore, illegal mining of gold and diamonds, which found its way into Liberia, fueling the civil war. And amidst all of this, the human consequence was devastated. Guyana is still at a point where those in charge today can do the right thing and step back, because I believe once you go down this path, it is extremely difficult. Guyana could be set back as much as 50 years in terms of arrested development.
Sam, given what Mike is saying, and clearly there are serious consequences here when you think about this from a business perspective, I want to throw some numbers to you. Guyana economy is a $4 billion economy. Importation, exports is about 1.5 billion. Imports is as probably big as the economy. Between the UK, Canada, and the US alone, we're talking about 46% of our exports, and importation, US alone accounts for about 60% of our imports. So my question to you is, sanctions clearly is a policy decision. And like any other policy, you're going to have to enforce and implement that policy. If in the context of Guyana, how difficult will this be for the US and anybody who levies sanctions against the government? How difficult would this be for them to enforce this on Guyana?
Well, first of all, let me say, this is to me? Or?
Yes, that's to you, Dr. Sam, but we lost your camera as well. So if you can turn your camera back on.
With me.
There you go.
We're back. Dhanraj, thank you for your introduction at the beginning, and nice to meet you, Jose and Mike, once again. First of all, I think it's important for those that are viewing tonight to know what sanctions actually are, because there are a number of varied sanctions, and they all have repercussions or consequences, more so than others. And there's a lot of research already undertaken of the consequences of sanctions. First of all, sanctions are an important tool of governance in the global financial industry, and is a common tool in foreign relations and peacekeeping or conflict resolution. And as we know, the US have indicated that the particular sanction that they would envisage is sanctions on individuals, or in terms of visas and maybe restrictions on access to the USA. That's a totally different consequence than a sanction for embargoes for exports or imports, or even for the freezing of assets of particular individuals, which I would assume after the first step, that would be the second step to be taken in sanctions. And it is the case that firstly that sanctions should only be a last resort and should not be taken lightly, as a lot of consequences or unknown consequences can come from the very simple sanctions made in terms of visa revocation, because that affects families as well. As I said, there are different types of sanctions. If you're talking about the visa type sanctions, it's a very good question as to how these things are enforced. And most times sanctions are enforced by further sanctions. And we've seen that in the sanctions against Russia and also against North Korea and Syria, because where there was breaches of sanctions, no one went in and arrested someone and said, I'm going to fine you $30 million or I'm going to send you to prison for 7 years. They were enforced by further sanctions. And that's what happened in the case in Russia as well. So it's a very difficult situation to enforce and to police. And in some cases, what they would say, well, we use domestic law in order to enforce sanctions. But that's only suitable if it's something like an anti-corruption sanction, because you have anti-corruption legislation in various countries. The USA and the UK have the primary legislation in terms of corruption, which can be enforced in either country for individuals or companies in foreign countries. So there are various ways of enforcing sanctions, but it is a very difficult situation to police. And I would be very interested to see what will happen in the future in terms of that. But I think what we need to think about is what do you do beyond the revocation of visas in the current climate of sanctions against individuals, and where do you go beyond that? Because that is when you come into serious consequences. And I'm talking about consequences of individuals who are not part of the initial political regime. You're talking about, let's say, for example, women who are employed between 60 and 80% of the labor industry, and they will be the first people to be hit if there is an export or import embargoes. And that has a great effect then on families. It has effect then on domestic violence. It has effect on crime trends and rising crime. And then you need policing to look after that. So there's lots of domino effects that take place just because of one particular sanction. So these things need to be thought out very, very carefully and clearly. I haven't heard yet exactly how the visa revocation is going to take place, and I don't think that has actually been publicized yet. So it may be that that is a threat, but bearing in mind that there is a legal process ongoing, I'm not sure how that will balance out whenever a country is not waiting until the legal procedure is completed. And that may be a bar to any restrictions in sanctions in the future. So I think those sort of things need to be thought out very, very carefully.
Jose, I want to come to you with a question from picking up from something that Sam says. Mm-hmm. We know the starting point here is visas, revocation of visas. Broadly, leaving out, there's many peculiarities and every situation would be different, naturally. But where do we go from here? What's the natural progression? How do things progress from here, assuming there is a consistent and repeated non-compliance, or we're not getting the situation resolved? How does things accelerate?
Okay, thank you. A great question, and Dr. Sittlington made some very, very good points about the progression of the sanctions. Where we're starting at is the revocation of visas is something that by authority the U.S. State Department possesses. They do not have to, for example, check with or receive concurrence or clearance from any other department of the federal government. So that is a decision by law that resides with the State Department. So they do not have to, because of privacy laws, they may not, they will likely not publicize the names, but that doesn't stop the individual affected from admitting I had my visa pulled. So they are, what I would imagine is that, since I worked in the State Department, is that they are compiling lists, and they will break down the entire electoral authority of Guyana and be looking for individuals who are basically in the press, in the media. Some of the high-profile names we've been reading about will likely be affected by the State Department decision. Beyond that, and I want that your audience is aware, as Dr. Sittlington said, is that we're talking about a long progression that could take place. And because if you see in Venezuela, the United States started with individual sanctions, and it was years, frankly, it was years before that was expanded to sectors of the Venezuelan economy. So what happens next? The other entity that would get involved next is the Treasury Department of the United States. And that is when we start talking about freezing assets and barring individuals from having any contact with the system. And so that is extremely dislocating to an individual to have to conduct their daily economic activities without touching the U.S. banking system in any way. We're talking about U.S. dollars. We're talking about banking relationships between banks in Guyana and banks in the United States. All of those would be affected. They would be cut off for the individual. And the Treasury Department has the authority to name that person in consultation with Justice Department and the State Department before they move on to those authorities. Now, there are numerous laws that are the imprimatur of the decisions on individual sanctions. But for most of your viewers, if you Google Global Magnitsky Act, you will see where many of the authorities come from for the United States to designate an individual. And when the designation means is the frozen, it freezes their any economic assets in the United States and bars them from any economic transactions, commerce that touches the US system. From there, then you go into sectoral sanctions, which again are when you talk about embargoes or when you talk about barring, for example, the Venezuelan oil sector is, the United States and its allies, other democracies have basically crippled the Venezuelan oil sector by targeting shipping and targeting banking. And so, but that is something hopefully that is in the a distant option, because right now the United States and I would assume other countries are going to join in the individual sanctions at this point, meaning, of course, the visa revocations. And if this continues again for, let's say, several weeks without a resolution, without a final declaration of results, then I think you would start seeing a further consideration of perhaps Global Magnitsky Act designations.
Okay. One clarification before I leave, before I go to the next question to Mike. Does the Treasury Department have unilateral decision-making over moving to the sanctions, the next level of sanctions? Or do they have to have corroborating sort of approval from any other division?
Yes, it would be a consultative mechanism, but Treasury retains the authorities to actually make the decision, but it would be done in consultation with, of course, Justice Department, the State Department, and naturally the White House.
Okay. Mike, there's a claim that is being made. We can live with the sanctions. Many countries are having sanctions. They survive with them, and we can do the same, so bring it on. Just so I'll give you some statistics. Cuba, the United States embargo and sanctions started somewhere in the 60s. At that time, in the 1970s, the Cuban economy was about $6 billion US. In 2018, it's about 100 billion. Population in 1970 was about 7.1 million. By 2018, it was about 11.4 million. So clearly, there is growth over that entire period. Yet this is a country that has been sanctioned by the US. So there is the claim, there is the evidence that we're going to hold on to. And this is a claim that is coming from some sections of the society, and particularly those who are involved in what is going on in Guyana. So how do you respond to that? Can Guyana really survive sanctions?
First of all, Cuba has been an outpost of terror, of trafficking, and all kinds of destabilizing influence in this hemisphere since the 1960s. Cuba has had a hand in every insurgency in this hemisphere, with the Sandinistas getting into power, the Farabundo Marquis Liberation Movement in El Salvador, in the assassination of several senators during the Allende time in Chile, and of course, helping to foment the problems we see today or not too long ago in places like Bolivia, headed by Evo Morales, who's no longer there. And of course, with their Chinese comrades, they have a hand in the Sendero Luminoso in Peru in the 70s, 80s, right up to the 90s. Cuba, for a small country its size, it punched above its weight as being a purveyor of evil because it had a political godfather in the form of the former Soviet Union. All the economic growth you talk about in Cuba has been retained only by the Castro brothers and their friends at the Granma newspapers and the likes of Roberto Robaina and, Ricardo Alarcon. There's no, you should ask someone who goes to Cuba, go into the rural areas and see the abject poverty and human suffering. If Cuba is really such a paradise, open the doors and say to people, you're free to leave. Let me get to the point. The sanctions, Guyana is not Iran. That's first of all understand. Iran can afford to wiggle its way around sanctions because the Chinese wants its oil, India was buying its oil, and even the Europeans were doing business with Iran. Guyana is a small country. When was the last time did you hear of a Christmas barrel coming to Guyana from Moscow or Beijing? It doesn't happen. Our livelihood, our patterns of migration, our economic linkages, the largest source of remittances resides in the United States. Guyana cannot in any way, shape, or form survive these sanctions unless the regime of the day in Guyana have become surrogates of the Chinese, and that we don't know about. Maybe we know no one wants to admit, but for heaven's sake, when more than 90% of your economic growth is tied to the Western countries, primarily the United States and Canada, maybe a lesser degree with Europe, it's virtually impossible for them. This is all talk. This is all rhetoric on the part of the regime in Guyana to keep their base. If they really think they can survive, let them bring it on. I can tell you 3 months of those sanctions and all hell is going to break loose in that country. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm telling you from what I've seen.
Sam, I want your take on that same question. There is the claim, bring the sanctions on, we can live with them, we can survive them, we can deal with it. Other countries have done it. Are we wrong? Are we right? Are we misplaced? Is that optimism misplaced?
First of all, let's put it into perspective. We're not at the death's door here right now. This is, from what I see, the first step. Visa revocation doesn't immediately affect vulnerable people or vulnerable sections of the community, women, children, minorities. This affects elitists, those who are in the positions of power and those who may be seen from foreign jurisdictions as being doing things which are not in the best interests of the country. This is the first step. What follows from that are the most serious sanctions, are the most serious repercussions of the first step. And I think let's bring it right down to basics. What is good for Guyana? What is good for the people? The people could not withstand embargoes and sanctions in terms of exports and imports. We don't want to be, I'm saying we, I'm talking like a Guyanese. I've been there so many times and I love the country. I'm talking like Guyana people do not need any more hurt than what they already have. COVID-19 is has a serious impact on the whole population. It needs to be managed. If, for example, there were further sanctions in terms of embargoes, in terms of equipment for hospitals or for health treatment or for jobs or for education or for employment, that's going to really hurt people. And these people don't need any more hurt. They're looking for solidarity. They're looking for something to move forward on, to be positive. And they're not getting that right now because there's so much isolation, there's so much diversity and in ideas and thoughts and processes. The sanctions from the US are their idea of trying to move things in a positive direction. As I said before, there are also other things going on in the sidelines, which we have to take consideration of, which are legalities. USA are also a country which went through the courts in terms of election fraud. So it's not unique to Guyana to go to the court to find out the truth about something that's going on in terms of elections. Many other countries have done that as well, including Zimbabwe and Libya and Palestine and Israel. All of those other countries involved in the same thing. So this is a first step, and I'm answering that way. The first step to see what happens, and it is the consequences of that first step in line what the US will do next. And I think that's the only way that you can play this right now. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know how they're thinking. But sanctions can take many forms. This hits one particular section of the community, those who are elitists in a particular position. It doesn't affect those in vulnerable positions who are employed or terms of market trade or business at the minute. But that could happen. And the US may be thinking down those lines right now. They could be thinking of freezing assets of individuals or companies, or stop companies from working in various jurisdictions. Those are all elements that could be thought about and could be enacted at any time. So I think we have to deal with what we have and move as that progresses. It is good, however, to think, well, what do we do if, what if, and what happens next? It would be a real hardship for Guyana if it went on to phase 2 or phase 3 of sanctions. And I'll leave it at that if anybody wants to jump in from
there. You understand the region. You understand Latin America. You understand the Caribbean. You understand how it works. You understand where Guyana is situated. You understand we're unique in a little bit of a sense, sitting on the South American continent and the coastline, former British colony, more Western oriented and integrated. But we have a perverse idea. We think we can withstand sanctions, and I know there's uncertainty around this. What is your take looking at it through from the region? Is that any way an informed claim, or is there any truth to that? Because the average person in Guyana, this is what we're trying to understand. That's what they hear from the people who have the megaphones. Don't worry about the sanctions. We'll keep doing what we're doing. We'll be all right. How do you respond to that?
Well, frankly, to me, it's an irresponsible approach, simply because of the impacts that, looking down the line, that they could mean for the welfare of the Guyanese people. I want to assure the audience, however, that, based on my conversations with people in Washington, is that, and this is something that really is characteristic of most policy debates like this in Washington, is that they're keenly aware of the risks of imposing more hardship on the Guyanese people. As you said, Guyana is unique. It's not a big 30 million population country like next door in Venezuela. It's a unique history, and certainly no one in Washington is thinking, let's figure out how we can really turn the screws. That's not what's going on up here. It's like Dr. Sittlington said, it's trying to jog the process forward within the means that that international stakeholders and friends of Guyana have to do so. And consequently, moral suasion hasn't worked. There have been repeated statements from the international community about the necessity of moving on and allowing the country to progress and deal with important issues that it has about its future. But it's going to depend on the behavior of the government. If the Granger government is perceived as continuing to employ tactics to prevent the declaration of results, they are going to force international stakeholders to keep revisiting what else can be done. But I see it as far as the short term is considered, is that the people who are seen to be responsible for the impasse and and I've heard the word gamesmanship being employed many times. Those people have the most to worry about because their lives will be impacted. But as far as the general population, I mean, in fact, Guyanese are already paying a price for the fact that they cannot move on. And so it's not in the interest of the United States or others to increase hardship for the Guyanese people. But as far as individuals that are seen to be unhelpful in concluding this electoral process, those are the ones that are going to have things to worry about for now.
Mike, so here's the argument. We know that sanctions are depending, again, there's a wide variety of them. They're very blunt instruments, yes? And they have consequences sometimes that are unintended, like every other policy decision. Assuming we move from the stage of just visa sanctions, and we get into other types of sanction, economic sanction that Jose referred to, and talk before you even go up to sectorial sanctions. Who exactly will be paying the price for these sanctions? You see, I want us to touch on something that is very important that I think we don't oftentimes get around to doing directly. And that is, when major powers impose a sanction, what is the intent? What is the mechanism through which that sanction works? When they take away people's visa, yes, naturally the person whose visa was revoked can't get to travel. They're restricted and limited. But when you move on beyond that and you start putting sanctions of trade sanctions or commerce sanctions on a country, who feels the pain? Who gets the hit then? Or what is the mechanism does that work through then?
The common man, the common woman, the average individual, child, innocent people, people who barely eke out a living, people who have been rendered almost oblivious to the regime of the day, the rural folks, the people in the city, everyone, because it will impact Guyana's ability to import goods. Maybe only humanitarian help or aid will be allowed into the country, but it will impact the cost of doing business. You have severe shortages that Guyanese had to endure in the 70s and 80s during that period of the commanding heights of the economy, where party paramountcy and where state intervention in every aspect of the person's life became the order of the day. To this day, this is why I hate socialism and communism in every form, because I suffered during those days. I spent my Saturdays lining up in huge lines just to get 2 pints of cooking oil, half a gallon of rice. I went through that. I know what Big Brother is. It is an immoral thing. Communism is worse than any form of cancer. And you know, dictators don't last for long. They end up very bad. Look at Mobutu Sese Seko. Look at many other dictators, you know, and dictators are usually selfish in their conduct. I don't know why you put people through this, but the common man and woman will feel it. There'll be shortages of medicine, medications. You will see a huge jump in mental illnesses, because people who are already living in a very depressed situation in Guyana, who are living in a situation today where they don't have the ability to earn an income. For the last 4 months, like the country has come to a virtual standstill. It's taking its toll on people. And you will see huge increases in mental illnesses. You'll see increases in crime, desperation. You will see price for basic goods go sky high. You might find people not being able to eat. I don't think they're really starving in Guyana because it's a fertile place, but instead of having 3 meals a day, they might only have 1 or 2. Businesses will suffer because if persons cannot earn, they cannot pay their electricity bills, they cannot pay for internet. All these things are going to have a cascading, cataclysmic effect on the quality of life for the average man, woman, and child. And as Jose said, and as Dr. Sittlington has emphatically said many times, that the people of Guyana do not deserve this. What Guyana needs, it's for people to step back, take a look at the bigger picture, and put Guyana first. If they don't, they're going to be handing a death sentence to people who deserve a better life. We went through this in the 70s and 80s. And you know, Dhanraj, I'll say this unequivocally and unapologetically. I will refuse at this age to stand up. You're going to have people fleeing Guyana. They're going to go in every direction they can go. They might join the Venezuelans in their sojourn to get out of a sad situation. By the time everyone have left, if the regime persists, as Erich Honecker in East Germany was once said, whoever leaves last, please switch the lights off. It's not good. And they still have an opportunity to come to their senses and snap out of that trance they're in, because this is not the 1970s. This is not the Cold War. If they're depending on the Chinese, they're too far away. This is all, people are guided here not for Guyana, but by narrow, selfish economic interest. And which decent human being, Dhanraj, will subject an entire nation to this kind of malevolence and this kind of suffering? Only heartless individuals, and I put right up there with people like Adolf Hitler and Goebbels and Himmler. No different.
I wish I was qualified to answer your question, dear Mike, but in terms of what kind of people this is, because I've seen some of the actions. Dr. Sam, I'm going to throw something to you here, and I want you to tear it apart for me. I was reading an article from one of these US think tank on sanctions, and here's the distinction that was made. That when you look at sanctions such as visa sanctions, there are sanctions that are directed to individuals, which you might have enforcement mechanism that you can hold the individual accountable. And like I said, for example, visas, that's an individual. But when you come to the other kinds of sanction, really and truly, the mechanism here is when you apply the sanction to a country, you put pressure on the people indirectly, and the hope is the people will stand up and demand differently from their leaders. If this is the case, then where Guyana is right now, it would make a lot more sense for the people to hold and demand from their representative now to do the right thing, instead of waiting until that time comes, since both of them it's the same mechanism. One is that you're going to choose to do it up front and choose voluntarily to do it up front, whereas in the other side, if sanctions come, they're going to apply pain to the rest of society, and then you will have no other choice but to revolt and hold the people, the leaders that you put there, accountable. Does that construct seem logical? Does it seem to make sense? Or is it at odds with what you know?
Well, I think I think you answered your own question. There's no doubt that economic sanctions will cause hardship in terms of prices and availability of products. And that in itself will cause hardship for those in domestic or commercial situations. Even to the extent that foreign banks will not operate with local banks. And local banks do need corresponding banks in order to transact currencies across various jurisdictions. Even if there are sanctions, economic sanctions, companies that have a link with outside jurisdictions, for example, in the US or in the UK, there will be sanction screening, and banks will have to conduct a due diligence or a risk management in how they deal with those various companies or individuals. So that in itself, if you stop the movement of funds between jurisdictions where you're talking about commodities that are necessary for Guyana or necessary for other countries from Guyana, then that is obviously going to create a pure hardship for those involved in that type of business. And of course, and as Jose has said, the US don't want that situation, but it happened in Venezuela, and the decline in Venezuela's socioeconomic status, crime inflation, poverty, hunger increasing due to Maduro and their economic policies. And those sanctions were put in place because of that. So, and that caused tremendous hardship for those people. The same thing will happen in Guyana. It's happened, as Michael said, in other countries in Syria and Sudan, in Ethiopia and Africa. Same problems. Sanctions are there to punish, or to try and, sorry, not to punish, to try and coerce a different behavior from individuals, whether they be ministers or politicians or whatever area of business that they're in. So they're there for a reason. They will cause hardship, and I think, as Mike said, Guyana doesn't need that right now. No country needs that. But we have seen in the past that sanctions are put in place in countries who are in a far worse state of affairs than Guyana. For example, Sudan, where there's constant hunger and inability to farm the fields because of lack of water, and still sanctions are put in place there to change the hierarchy, to get them to change what they're doing to harm the people. And that's the whole point of sanctions. It's a sorry state of affairs if it ever gets to that stage. But Guyana is in a unique position in terms of their wealth and future wealth in terms of oil, and their land commodities in terms of gold. Should be in a much better position than they are. And I just want to say one thing. I've been doing some research in terms of local people and what they're looking for. And 4 things: education opportunities, programs for youth to expand education levels and international access through the universities. They want to better themselves. They want to create better qualifications so that they can study overseas, they can come back to Guyana and give something back to the country. They want rule of law. They want good policing structures in place. This petty corruption of police officers we've seen in many countries, not just unique to Guyana, but this is a complaint of Guyana. Rule of law, people need to feel safe. Somebody was telling me they can't even go to the park to jog early in the morning because they're afraid of getting mugged in the early morning. You know, this is getting ridiculous. Another thing, united against racism, which affects jobs, affects university places, wages, qualifications, and experience. Sometimes people are looking for qualifications instead of good experience, but people can't get experience when they leave university. There's no mechanism between the education and the experience, the practical side of things. So they want something in between that gives them that practical experience and allows them to go to further jobs and expand the human resources development in the country. 4 areas that local research has pulled up, and sanctions affects all of those 4 things. Hardship, jobs, education, health, particularly health right now where you've got COVID-19, where you need places of safety for people who are infected. And they need to be well looked after. They need good hospitals, good locations, good treatment, good doctors. And if you can't have your own doctors educated in your own country, you have to bring them in from other countries. So you're dependent on other people. If you have sanctions, you may not be able to use people from other countries. This is just the consequences of sanctions. Hopefully it'll never come around.
I'm going to come back to you and pick up on something that you said, but I know Jose has a hard stop, and I want him to address this question before he goes. So here is, I've heard all the I'm one of those guys. Let me assume I'm creating a hypothetical here for you, Jose. I'm one of the guys who are trying to undermine democracy and the completion of this election in Guyana. I've heard about the sanctions, heard about it, and I've said, look, let them bring it on. And here's my thing. When the sanctions come, we'll find workaround. We'll find other partners. If the US don't want to play, Western democracies don't want to play, we'll find other partners. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's a very difficult proposition, and I think Mike said it well at the top of the broadcast. The embedded not only historical links, economic links between the United States and the Guyanese people. Very, very difficult to undo those types of relationships. And I think that, you know, again, when we're talking about the sanctions, you know, we're trying, because the United States has the unique technical capacity to devise and divine these sanctions, it sort of puts the United States out there. But it's important to remember in this discussion that the United States is also acting in concert with CARICOM, with the OAS, the Commonwealth, the UK, Canada, Norway. So it's important to remember that this is a multilateral approach to trying to get the attention of certain individuals that have decision-making authority in Guyana to, as we've discussed, wrap up this electoral process. So when you look at who is arrayed out there, who has expressed concern about the impasse in Guyana, you know, those who aren't part of it sort of stick out. I mean, you will have the Russias, you will have the China, you will have Cuba out there. You know, so you kind of get an idea of who's willing to operate outside the, you know, what we used to call the West. And that means the United States, Europe, other Latin American countries. Then, you know, your opportunities are correspondingly shrinking, and they're you know, the cost of doing business with China versus the cost of doing business with the United States, simply by virtue of distance, and Russia and Iran and others, it's going to be extremely expensive, and not to mention the difficulty of reorienting economic ties, you know, that again have years, decades of operation. Very, very difficult to do. You know, China has, everybody wants to believe China is, you know, some sort of miracle worker, that they have the money and the will. But, you know, China has a lot of problems of its own. And, you know, we're talking about China 2020, not China a decade ago. And the idea that China is going to come in and supplant economic relations between Guyana and the United States, that's a very, very risky proposition. Whole number of fronts. And of course, Russia is nothing but a troublemaker. They have no, it's a, as John McCain once said, it's a gas station masquerading as a country. It's going to be of little use to Guyana. And the idea that you want the Iranians to come and help you, or helping Maduro next door, very, very limited capacity too. They are, again, sanctioned out the you know what, and their capabilities very, very limited.
You mentioned something. Let me get your thoughts on this quickly before we lose you.
By all means.
You mentioned something at the beginning that, you know, Washington has been paying attention to the backsliding of democracy in the region. I'm going to throw you out on the limb here. Is there an appetite, or what's the size of the appetite that globally and led by the U.S. and with the, sort of in the Western framework, to see democracy continues to slide further down in the region and in Guyana, especially, like I said, with Guyana being one of those countries, the only country with this sort of strong Western connection because of a former colony from Britain. Is there any appetite at all to let this carry on, let this drag along, risk having it go into decay and dismay?
Well, you know, we've talked about Venezuela a bit. It's a great question, Dhanraj. Is that what Venezuela taught many people in our own hemisphere is that if you don't deal with the problem at the beginning, you are only setting the stage for a much worse situation, much worse for everybody involved, primarily the citizens of the country. Because the region did not take a unified stance on Venezuela for many years, it allowed the situation to fester and get worse. And that is what motivates policymakers today that and I know that it informs approaches in CARICOM, OAS, and other multilateral bodies that if we don't try and do something up front, it's going to bring about the situation that we all want to avoid. That is going further, sectoral sanctions, ostracization of leaders, suspension from multilateral bodies. All of that could very well take place if the current government chooses to accede to the will of the people.
Jose, I know you have to go. It's a pleasure to have you. Certainly we'd like to continue the conversation with you. There's a lot more questions that we have that we'd love to have the Washington perspective on this. So thank you, and I know you have to go. If there's any final thoughts and words that you would like to leave with not just the leaders in Guyana, those who are struggling to protect this democratic process, the partners, but more specifically to the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's my pleasure to join the distinguished panel. Great conversation. Thank you very much. I remain an optimist. I want a peaceful resolution as soon as possible. I do not want to see a tearing up of sanctions that, again, will ultimately mean that some of the the comments by Sam and Mike, the collateral damage on the Guyanese people, it's something I don't want to think about. I don't want to contemplate. I hope we don't get there.
I appreciate your thoughts, Jose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm going to come back to something. I'm going to come back to something that you said earlier. You talk about the pain and how this can trickle down to the average person. I want to give you two statistics from the U.S. in particular. I mentioned earlier that 60% of our imports almost comes from the United States alone. Of that amount, 2/3 about it is for capital items, as you rightfully mentioned, like an MRI machine, medical equipment, or machineries. In addition to that, about 300 million US annually goes into Guyana from families well, not just the US, but families abroad that sends remittances to Guyana. And there was a study that was done a couple of years ago by the Bank of Guyana that shows that 50% of remittances are used for food and clothing, two of the most basic necessities. Now, if this should escalate, as again, we clearly don't contemplate it, we don't want it, we hear all of that. But clearly the people who are fighting, who are trying to get their way with the electoral process are not relenting. And so I want people to understand that if this gets escalated and we end up in a situation where we're pulling those levers and pulling those commerce and sanctions, one simple restriction such as money transfers and money movements with the banks in the US and doing any banks in Guyana, what's the damage like that is going to look like for the country and for people?
I don't have the statistics, but from a common sense perspective, if you can't move money, you can't purchase. If you can't purchase goods, you're going to have scarce resources, and those resources are going to go into the black market, the grey economy, and they are going to be extortionate to purchase. That most people will not be able to afford that, and that then consequence is a raise in crime rates. So I can only say, I can only answer your question by saying that yes, it would cause severe hardship if you have sanctions in terms of movements of monies or freezing of assets in various jurisdictions. It has to be, if I was speaking from a money laundering perspective, if I was targeting someone involved in organized crime, drug trafficking, or something like that, then we freeze their assets, whether they're in, we freeze their assets, whether those assets are in any other foreign jurisdiction or locally in the UK, Guyana, or wherever. And that is recommended to be a deterrent to them before they even get to court for a criminal conviction. So the deterrent effect of funding has a greater impact than sentencing. Now, turn that into a commercial sense. If you can't move funds for commercial activity, legitimate commercial activity, that's going to have serious consequences for those businesses and their employers, employees, and those who they deal with locally or internationally. So yes, it's definitely going to have severe consequences.
Mike, if the sanctions escalate and we remain with the attitude, and when I say we, I am referring to the individuals who are continuously trying to act. If we remain with the attitude that, okay, we'll brave the storm, we'll look for alternative routes. How do you enforce? How do you punish? How do you put teeth onto the sanctions beyond the fact that you're imposing them? Are there alternative levers that can be used to push for compliance?
Well, yes, the international banking system, the United States Treasury, the United States Department of Commerce will publish the names of companies and institutions in Guyana that are debarred from conducting any kind of business transaction, commercial or what have you, between Guyana and the United States. I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm a company in Guyana and I want to place an order with Cisco, as an example, or Microsoft or HP for purchase, either through from them directly or let's say one of their distributors in the United States. There are a few, you have like in Miami, there are a number of these big companies, let's say Data. So once the order, let's say, so, they try to place an order, yeah, they may accept the order, but then when they attempt now to ship it, US Customs, you've got to submit your bill of lading. You've got to submit your origin of goods. And everything is done electronically. And automatically, the destination is now blacklisted by the United States Department of Homeland Security through its border, enforcement, customs, border enforcement people at the various ports. And immediately say to the shipper, sorry, but you cannot export this computer, this printer, or anything to this jurisdiction, to this destination, because this country is now the subject of United States commercial and financial sanctions. Now, there are persons who may find surreptitious way of getting around it by having the exports they need shipped from the US to a third country, and then from that third country into Guyana. And that is very dangerous because let's say they order the equipment from Guyana, from Miami, but the final destination of the document is not Guyana, it's Trinidad. Then they attempt them to move it into Guyana. They may get away with 1 or 2 shipments. But the moment you plug in that computer, each computer device has a unique MAC ID assigned to it, or an IMEI number. So electronically, if I got this computer, I brought it to Guyana, but it was destined to Trinidad, and I plug it in from the IP address, the Microsoft and the Cisco servers can let them know exactly where this machine is being activated from. And those companies have the ability to render that machine useless. Because
so there are a lot of administrative, there are a lot of technical, especially in the digital age, enforcement mechanism that they
That's right. That's right. They could render the Microsoft operating license is null and void.
Sam, here's a question that I have for you. And you know, like I said, this is not the only conversation that is happening and is happening around sanctions. And oftentimes we hear the first side of the story, which is, yes, people are getting sanctions and they ought to comply and all of that. And so in this conversation, what we try to do is to give people more of the meat. None of us wants this to escalate to a state where we're going to talk about economic sanctions. There's no right-minded Guyanese who will say, that's okay, or we expect that reality. But if history has shown us anything, is that even countries who are today sanctioned never wanted to get there. And if the non-compliance and the continued efforts to undermine democracy continues, you might very well force the hands of the international community. And I think you talk about this earlier when you said if that's the case, then you're going to have to grapple with these realities. But as you sit here and you have heard about all that we have talked about, if I ask you, what is one thing that we should know about sanctions that we probably don't know at this moment, or we have not touched on, what would that be?
We didn't discuss the various types of sanctions, and they're all manufactured for various reasons. Let me just give an example. There's a sanction on Russia athletes from attending the Olympic Games because of doping scandal. So that is a particular sanction on athletes in Russia who are banned from attending a sporting event because of that doping scandal. That is a sanction. So they will not be able to take part. But in saying that, and this is just to put it in, just to try and explain it a little bit better, there are exemptions to sanctions. And if a particular individual, country, or company has a good reason that they need to do business outside of the jurisdiction and in breach of a sanction, they can apply to have that exemption. So it's not cut and dry that everyone is banned from doing anything in a particular sanction. You know, it depends on the circumstances. So that is available. I don't want this to be like a fear-mongering discussion. because many people listening will say, what are we going to do? This is going to cause severe hardship. It's not the case right now. This is the first step. In fact, it may not even have been implemented yet. It's a discussion at this present time. And I think Jose alluded to the names of the individuals will be given to them individually and not publicized. Whether that happens or not, I mean, I've heard of people who have had visas revoked, but it never happened. And so things change all of the time, and circumstances change, and new ideas and new decisions being made. Something else I wanted to say in terms of visa. I'll come back to that. So all is not lost on its first stage of their idea of trying to make change in Guyana.
Okay, Mike, we're heading just over the hour, so we're going to wrap this up. I want you to, like I mentioned before, there is no Guyanese in their right mind. No one of our regional partners in their right mind wants Guyana to go down this route. So it's important that the elections and the declaration of these results come to an end. So far since the March 2nd election, the Guyanese people have shown a resolve to patience, non-disorderly behavior. They have weathered 4 months of this storm in an unimaginably peaceful way. But clearly, if this continues to go on and continues to go on, that frustration is going to build up. It's clearly going to. Do you think that there is success? The country is going to get to a point in the near future, sooner rather than later, with these international agencies taking a hard stand and starting to pull the levers of sanctions on Guyana? And I ask that question because one of the most common questions I get from the average person every day is, why is our international partners not doing something about it now and only saying that they will do something about it? And so I get that all the time. So with the US pulling that lever, do you see this heading into a direction where it's going to come to an end? And so how would you respond to the average individual with that concern?
Well, the United States, over the last 4 months, the EU, Canada, the Norwegians, the Commonwealth, the elders, the people down in Africa, Mandela's people, every person have tried in some way, shape, or form in a charitable and kind and respectful tone, implored the powers that be in Guyana to respect the democratic process and the outcome. And, in Guyana, they say there is a saying, give me the plantain or give me the porridge. I am a big believer in, the stick and the carrot. I come from the old school, spare the rod and spoil the child. There must be consequences for bad behavior, right? If you don't have consequences, you're going to have a total state of madness and people just doing what they need to do. We have to operate in a rules-based environment, right? We have to. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos. It's going to be the strong taking advantage of the weak. And very soon, everything gets out of whack. You have a whole revolution in your hand, and law and order breaks down. As every man jack himself, we don't want that. People have been patient. I congratulate the powers that be in the opposition for having conducted themselves with great magnanimity, resolve, and humility. I congratulate all Guyanese. I was there on the day of the polling. Everything went smoothly. I attempted to vote, but I couldn't because I couldn't find my name. It had not been registered since 2011. I understood that. But everything went smooth. But for 4 months, to be on this merry-go-round, man, I feel the people of Guyana are like the rat on that wheel in a cage. You're going from one court process to the other. It's like a roller coaster or a merry-go-round. You just need to get off. I mean, I have lost track of how many times you went to the court, for what reason. That itself is an excruciating exercise to be documenting all these things, how many times you went to the court. This thing has to come to a stop. And if it takes some tough medicine, let it be. You can't hold an entire nation to ransom. There has to be an end. This cannot be a recurring decimal every week you're in the court. People are already dealing with COVID-19. They're already dealing with the loss of income. What else do they want to do? Just punish them, take them to the gallows, euphemistically abusing this. But I think that the time for games are over, and these international organizations have been more than patient. The visa, I think, is a nice way of telling them, hey, we mean business. This is an opportunity. I was appalled reading that Secretary of State Pompeo called President Granger twice, and he would not take the call. This is the Secretary of State of the most powerful nation in the world. When he calls you, you stand to attention, you take the call. We are in no pecking order to dictate to the United States. We need them more than they need us. So I'm hopeful that good sense prevails. Everyone snaps out of the trance they're in and deal with a harsh, brutal reality. And if you don't comply, there are going to be imbued consequences. When these consequences come, there'll be no turning back, because the damage it's going to inflict, it's going to be cataclysmic and catastrophic in terms of human suffering. Dhanraj, I have friends, I have relatives there. I've seen what these things could do, and I'm praying to God, and I'm imploring President and others, do the right thing for humanity.
Sam, last question that I'll have for you, and I'll also ask after you answer the question to leave your final thoughts on this. If you are unfortunate enough to reach to the stage where you have economic sanctions in place, how easy it is to have them lifted? And like I said, after your response to that question, give us your final thoughts on the situation in Guyana and where you see things, how you see things unfolding. We have 4 minutes to play with. Then I'll give it to you.
What's your first
half of the session?
With your first question is very easy. I mean, a sanction is there placed to change a situation, and once that situation is changed, and the international body that invoked the sanction are satisfied, and the United Nations are satisfied, then I assume things would change after that. My last words. I also was asked why international community weren't doing something. I was also asked why were the international community interfering. So you get both sides of that conflict. The international community have always supported Guyana and many other countries in terms of training and infrastructure projects and technical equipment as well. And I was also involved in that in my work in Guyana. My final words, I suppose, when I was in Guyana, we talk about one nation, one people, and I would just say, give the people some peace. That would be my final words. I totally liked Mike's personal, very emotive view and his thoughts on Guyana.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. Mike, any final thoughts?
Rather than, I'm a believer in Mahatma Gandhi, and I believe we must become our brother's keeper. I would like to see both sides reach in the middle. I would like to see President Granger and the opposition and civil society and everyone come together. Let bygones be bygones. Let us turn a new page and give the people of Guyana an opportunity that they deserve for a better tomorrow. We are in the precipice of great things with the oil and gas. But if a country becomes ungovernable and unstable, all of these things can become yesterday's news, because no self-respecting investor will want to put a penny in a country where you don't have the rule of law. I promote 4 things: respect for the individual, transparency, accountability, good governance, the rule of law, and most importantly, tolerance and respect. The people of Guyana have suffered. This is our chance. I'm tired of my homeland having been looked down upon by the rest of the Caribbean. I always make the analogy, I told Dr. Sittlington, Guyanese are like the Irish of the Caribbean. We've migrated to every part of the world, and we've done well. Why can't we do great things for our country and be safe and secure on our own soil? We can take a lesson from the Celtic wonder, Ireland, which still had pit latrines right up to the 70s. Today, Ireland is the home to so many great companies. Google, Facebook, everyone is there. Guyana's problem is that we must understand you're not going back to India, and the chap in Pleasance is not going back to Africa. And I invoke the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. We learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we perish as fools. If the Catholics and the Protestants could have found common ground with the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, and I've been watching this series I told Dr. Sittlington called Titanic, Blood and Steel. It's about the construction of the Titanic, how divided the society was. And it's a good series to look at. Guyana is too small a place for anyone to live in poverty. And so I'm hopeful that good sense will prevail and everyone wakes up to the reality. What is more important, in my opinion, than the PPP or the PNC? It is Guyana. It is time people started putting country first. And I will be very happy to play a mediating role in bringing all parties together, because I don't belong to any political party. I'm interested in the well-being of the common man.
I think that would be a good way to end this session, and perhaps the first step in giving all Guyanese a chance is to listen to them through what they have said in the ballots. That is certainly the best place to start. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and thank you for your time. We always try to bring these discussions to you to help us to educate ourselves on the issues. We bring the experts from all around the world to give us a sight and insights and their experience that we were not always privy to. But thanks to technology, we can access people all across the world. Dr. Sam, thank you for your time and the experiences that you've shared with us. Mike, thank you for your time. And you all have a very good weekend, rest of the weekend and week ahead. Thank you all.
Dhanraj, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Dhanraj, and thank the Guyana Budget and Policy Institute for the valuable work you're doing. This is you yourself, you're an amazing leader. Your institute is cutting edge, informed, intellectual, well-driven, and I'm happy to have shared my thoughts and available, like Dr. Sittlington, I'm sure, to be in any other calls you may have planned.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Bye-bye.